This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the August TAC workshop. We have a couple agenda items. First is the SJTPO project evaluation process review. And then we also have New Jersey Transit with us that's going to be presenting on their, I believe it's the transit planning new toolkit, and then also the Atlantic City line operations study. So kind of a full agenda, so just to kind of get right into it. Regarding our project evaluation process, which was adopted in 2020 and used for the first time in the FY or Federal Fiscal Year 2022 TIP. And so that was a great learning process for us to apply it the first time. And as you may or may not know, the overall objective of that project evaluation process is really to ensure that all of our projects are aligning as much as possible with federal, performance-based planning and federal guidance and priorities, as well as our RTP goals. So with that in mind, I just wanted to share a couple updates and then kind of open the floor to discussion. So firstly, if you look at the project evaluation process, one of the first things we're supposed to do are site visits. Site visits were not held during the 2022 TIP due to COVID, but it is our anticipation to do select site visits based on the projects that are submitted and conversations with our stakeholders. So, and that they may include, I guess just staff, or it could be staff with, county engineers or whoever would like to attend these. But we'll kind of coordinate that as we move on. So that's the first piece. Secondly, Taylor, our new assistant planner, if you haven't met her, and I will be soliciting for the FY 2024 TIP projects probably within this week, if not next. And this is going to be a great opportunity for you to submit new projects or refine existing projects for federal fiscal years 2024, 25, 26, and 27, which represents our constrained 4-year TIP. I say last year, but the last TIP cycle, the project evaluation process didn't really start until October, which didn't give us an enormous amount of time to have some of the back and forth and more in detailed conversation. So hopefully this August start will give us a better time to run through the project criteria and get further insight from everyone who's soliciting the actual projects. So those are sort of like the high level updates. If anyone has any questions or thoughts on that, I'll entertain them. Okay, just for anyone online, Jennifer put the link to the project evaluation criteria in the chat, and I will also just pull those up now since we'll kind of go into a couple of them, if I still have it open.
Jason, I could share if that would be helpful.
I got it. All right. So the first one I just wanted to kind of touch on. All of these are fairly minor, thoughts or revisions. So obviously, if anyone who's on the other side of things has like a red flag that you noted during our previous communications and scoring the projects, stop me and let me know. But the first item is under criteria, or the section 1, and is traffic congestion. So under traffic congestion, This one is really related or tied to our RTP goal number 2, which is mitigate traffic congestion and promote efficient system operation. And this is one of the several criteria that doesn't have a specific measurable or maybe clear measurable metric, whereas roadway condition is very, it's this condition is this points and so forth. And if you look at the scoring instruction for this criteria,
Possible to just click X on that box. Not that one, not that X. The X below it. I wonder if that'll get rid of the.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. For the people in the room can now see. So under traffic congestion,
It's actually hard to read on our side too.
okay, I can.
I can see Andy shaking his head. Yep, if you zoom in, that'd be much better.
Sure.
You can zoom in on our side too, but that makes it easier to at least see on a little bit better on our side.
Is this better? I just zoomed in. Can you see it better, Jennifer?
Andy's shaking his head, so I will say yes.
Okay. I can't see anyone shaking their heads right now because I'm sharing a screen, so you have to use verbal confirmation, please.
You are good to go, Jason.
Thanks. So as you can see, like the scoring instructions for this particular criteria is to what degree will the project improve traffic congestion? So this leaves a little bit of room for interpretation. When staff kind of sat through and evaluated this a little bit, there were some, well, first I should say we have several means of identifying if a location is congested. There's a RITIS tool platform and it's called congestion scan. And we can look at different peak hours, 24-hour periods, and, over, a week, a month, a year. And we can kind of determine, is this a congested location? But from there, we're looking at what kind of project is being proposed, the project description, and, there's certain things like low-hanging fruit. Is there a bike lane being included? We would assume that would reduce congestion on some level. Or if the work included an intersection and there was a signal, some sort of timing would count towards improving congestion theoretically. But short of that, it gets even more vague, perhaps, in terms of, what do we want to count? So kind of keep that in mind just for a moment. And then there's another criteria I'll scroll down to. This is still section 1, and it's on-road mobile source emissions. And this is related to our RTP goal 9, protecting the environment and complement land use plan. And you can see here it's sort of a similar verbiage. To what degree will this project reduce or mitigate on-road mobile road source emissions? And so we find, some of the things that we would score a project on are very similar to what we would be scoring the project on for traffic congestion. And traffic congestion is related to on-road mobile source emissions. So in some ways they're duplicate of each other, but not entirely, right? So I don't know. So I guess there's no necessarily clear answer to either one of these, but I'd like if anyone has any thoughts or concerns, one option would be, staff could delve in a little bit deeper and come up with something more similar to, bridge condition and have very, prescriptive criteria within the scoring that would be, I guess, more transparent in some ways. Another potential option would be combining those two criteria into one criteria. Something to note in section 1, and I'll see how this is, there's a lot of different criteria. I apologize for the scroll. I'm just trying to find the words. Here we go. The sum of scores for section 1 is the highest of 3 different evaluation criteria in this category. So right now we have, I think there's 5 different categories in section 1, six different sections and 6 different categories in section 1. So if we combine those two, it wouldn't really be detrimental, I don't think. But that's one option.
And it seems like the big question to me is if you know, there's an agreement that they are duplicative. I mean, because that's the biggest concern, I think. Is
Yeah.
that, you know, you don't want to just have every score basically appear twice. And, you know, an average project, a regular project, if it doesn't trigger that criteria, you know, whatever it does trigger would count once. And then any project that, you know, triggered those criteria would get counted twice. So that's, you know, maybe not what we had intended when, you know, when we set out with that. So I think to me that's like the number one question is if we realistically feel like there's a differentiation that we can make between the two. And then at that point, it might make it easier for us to go back and say, okay, here's some more
measurable sort of criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be too rigid, but like, I mean, there is something nice to, you know, some of these where it's like, okay, if you're this, you receive this number of points. You know, I still like some professional judgment, but if we can identify specific things that we think count for emissions, and that's different than things that we want to count for congestion, you know, I mean, we can always just carve out that emissions is going to be about this, and congestion is going to be about that. We just don't want both of them to be about all the same stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point of clarification. Does anyone have any thoughts on if they're, you know, if they're too redundant of one another, or specific ways to gauge if one of those categories, how we would score it, other than like bike lanes or signal work or something else?
Well, I'm thinking back to my time when I was in local aid, and we were coming up with scoring sheets for grant programs, and one way to score things is a range of points based on you know, different attributes or whatever. Another is a yes or no. Yes, you get the points. No, you don't. And anyway, that's an approach.
Yeah. So almost simplify it even further, like rather than to what degree, it's just will it or will it not.
Yeah, I mean, when we were discussing it in-house a little bit, I mean, the congestion, it seemed like it came down to two questions. One is the area congested, and then does the project improve the congestion? So
Right.
that's, you know, that's kind of where you have the opportunity in congestion for that professional judgment, I guess. That is it congested is a little bit more, I don't want to say binary in the sense that it either yes it is or no it isn't. There can be a kind of a gradation, a scale to it, but then does it improve on it? That's where, you know, we can apply some judgment based on some of the priorities that we have. Emissions, for me personally, is harder because it's not an area I'm as familiar with, but the big question at the end of the day is, are we going to just end up scoring everything based on bike lanes and signal timing and, you know, things like that at the end of the day? So.
Yeah, I mean, I should maybe mention, I left out, but like for on-road mobile source emission reductions, there are several calculators and toolkits to help. It's not for every type of project, but there's a range of different projects that you can input certain data, and it'll give you, you know, it'll compute in just a simple Excel format what the reduction is. But there's not something, you know, there's not every project type. It's like a couple different key categories.
Is your sense that's because other project categories don't have an emission benefit, or it's just kind of a limited tool at this point?
I think, well, that particular toolkit is geared towards CMAQ projects,
Yeah.
where the emphasis of the project is to reduce emissions. So I think it's supposed to like kind of stand out above and beyond what a normal project would be in terms of any emission benefits. All right.
Well,
Yeah.
It's kind of a different direction, but another option. Like, what if, to eliminate the potential duplicate counting, if for the emissions you excluded out congestion reduction? that it would be other types of projects that would reduce emissions but not congestion, so you don't double count.
Right. So exclude certain, yeah, I think so. That's almost like refining the selection, like the parameters of what would count, right? So, okay. So we don't have to have like a final answer to any of this. We could evolve this through the process, like as real projects come in, we can like kind of delve into it a little bit deeper, and then also, we can kind of scramble internally a little bit based on the feedback that we do have and come up with something too. So I didn't want to leave it all. The traffic congestion was probably the two that traffic congestion and emissions were two of the key ones, but I did want to also, unless there's any other comments from anyone online.
Jason, the only thing that I could say, I did pull up the criteria scoring that we had before, and just because it was easiest, I looked at the Cumberland County projects because they have as a road program, so they had 4 different roadways, and maybe Doug could distinguish whether or not they're different, but it's County Route 617, 626, 650, and 699. And in all 4 of them under the traffic congestion scoring criteria received an 8 out of 15. And then similarly for on-road mobile source emissions, they received an 8 out of 15 as well. So I can't speak to the projects, but I could share what the actual scores were for both of those 2 categories.
Okay, so so I'm happy to, I can give a little bit of insight into it just real briefly on how we decided the points. And this is sort of touches on one of the next criteria when I kind of talk about, but we gave sort of a, because we didn't have some of these things maybe as flushed out, or maybe it was just harder to apply it to the types of projects. It was like, well, okay, if the road is in poor condition, and we're talking about congestion, making a clean, smooth riding surface, in and itself is a benefit. Like it should, people aren't dodging potholes, people aren't like going over, rough surface, etc. So we gave that, maybe it was an 8. I couldn't tell you.
Like half score.
Half score. And then above that, maybe certain types of drainage work to make it where people weren't, that would kind of reduce traffic if there weren't puddles in the road. So like that would be, 8+1 or something like that. That's how we approached it on the last cycle.
And if I can throw in there, as we were developing these, I mean, we listed the criteria, based on the federal priorities and the RTP goals. And, we knew when we started last time that some of these were things we didn't have a system in place or a tool in place to use. So, any place that we had a tool in place and everybody was comfortable with the tool, we used the tool. But there were areas where we kind of always expected that we would have to come back when we had something more, like freight, for example.
Well, that's,
and I know that'll be a next item you'll talk about, so I don't want to steal your thunder, but we knew freight was coming down the pike. So, for the last selection, we just basically said, hey, to what degree will it benefit freight? And we left it there, knowing that hopefully by the next time around, i.e. this time, we'd be able to make that one more specific. And I think that stands for any of them where we didn't have a tool, and it's just sort of, professional judgment. And then, I think at that point, and this way it was sort of maybe a little bit laughable that, oh, look, all the scores were an 8. But, what we were trying to do was be consistent. When you're looking at this kind of, subjectively, what you don't want to do, what we didn't want to do, was to kind of arbitrarily nitpick, tiny differences that we perceived and say, okay, well, this is a 7-point versus this is an 8-point. So we kind of tried to almost categorize everything and lump everything together so that we weren't.
Yeah,
we just didn't want to be arbitrary.
Eliminate bias.
Yeah, we just didn't want to be too arbitrary. So, if that everybody got 8 points thing seems kind of silly. you'd know more about those
In
projects.
fairness, it wasn't all of them. It was just 4 of the ones.
Yeah, I know, no, but
Yeah, and they did.
it's worth bringing up. It's worth,
Yeah,
it's worth bringing up. So,
there is different scores for different categories. I was just comparing the mobile source and the traffic congestions. They were all the same.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I still do think that points to those two criteria right now at the end of the day are very similar criteria, and figuring out either how to differentiate them, or as you suggested, if we can't differentiate them, perhaps we consider combining them, and we acknowledge that they're both, because they're both priorities, they're both goals of ours. But if we can't make the differentiation, then possibly we consider, emissions / congestion. So
Yeah.
that was where that mindset came from.
Any other thoughts? Okay. So, so kind of piggybacking or continuing the thought on freight with that Alan just mentioned, you can see here still on the screen under section 1, which is goal 4, to what degree would the project improve the movement of freight on the regional network? So in the last tip cycle, we didn't have much in terms of, accurate data, or at least system-wide data. And we just completed the data collection technical study on freight. So now we have a lot of different types of data to look at and to evaluate this particular criteria. After some, initial internal discussion, we came up with 2 that would probably be the most beneficial, and it would be kind of in conjunction with one another, but it would be ADT, so overall truck volume.
Just the freight ADT.
Freight ADT. And so that would give us an idea, then we could, get into details once we sort of start breaking it up, but is there essentially a low, a medium, and high? We could have 5 different categories or whatever, but a range. And then we would look also at, so that'd be like a base point. If it's a high, so I don't know what the threshold is, but we have to delve into that, but you would get, maybe 10 points. And if it was low, you get 5 points, medium, 10 points, somewhere in that range. And then we would also look at the other data point, which is important for like local freight programs. So it'd be 10% of the volume is truck. So we have that from the data collection study. So now we know. So that would help some of the roads that maybe don't have a large number of real trucks using there's only maybe 50 trucks, but as a percentage of all the vehicles using that road is really high. So that would kind of be beneficial to some of the maybe non-state highway or county corridors. And then that would be a base again, like maybe 3 points or 5 points. Is it over 10 or under 10? And then you add the 2 together for a total of 15 or out of 15. So that was our initial sort of thoughts in terms of how we could use the freight data. There's a lot of other pieces of information that came out of the freight study that we could, use to kind of help guide if, a project might want to look at turning radii based on, volumes of truck, or if we have also got data on bridge limitations, overheight height restrictions. So we can kind of loosely apply all of that to every project, or at least provide it as an informational piece. But what we'd actually score on is ADT and percentage.
Well, I think what we talked too about, right, is that would sort of determine like that max benefit, and then you would still have to determine like, does the project benefit?
So that's
like a resurfacing would always get like half credit of whatever the max was, and then if you're doing something right, improving turning radii or whatever else.
Right. No, that's
then
good.
That would add, and that would get you to that max.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. So the same thing with a lot of these criteria. It's first identifying what the current situation is, and then how is the project going to impact that situation.
The one thing that I want to point out, Jason, is that all of, obviously the ADT is something that we could be able to have access to, and we wouldn't expect that to come from the county as the suburbs, I assume, but any description that would benefit, that, you know, that would make an improvement to any of these things that you're talking about would come from the subregions.
That's correct. I mean, the way, if you recall, if everyone recalls, the way we sent out the project sheets last time was it was a pretty large Excel document, and we had, you know, all the different criteria lined up in columns, and then you'd have your project, each project in a row, and you would, you know, give us some sort of information as to how your project related to or improved upon each of those criteria. And then based on that, we had, you know, we did some emailing back and forth to try to get either additional information or clarity on something, or we would kind of run it through the data that we had and came up with like some preliminary scores. So that's sort of the back and forth that's outlined in the evaluation process. So if there's no objections to that, what we could do is we could kind of come up with at least kind of better define those two, you know, evaluations, and then share that with everyone. And then if we need to adjust like the weighting of the score, we can, you know, that can be flexible.
Jason, would it be beneficial if you scored, you know, I don't know where you guys are in the process just yet, but it would be beneficial to look at the old projects that you scored with that new consideration to see how this scoring may have been changed or impacted?
Well, so I guess we'd have to find a project that either did not or did do something to improve freight. I think the first step though is determining how would we apply, like what are we looking at in order to apply the point. So is it over 10% volume of trucks? You know, we need to kind of come to some sort of consensus. Is that worth 5? Is that worth 10? And then just truck volume, is that worth 5 or 1 or whatever the numbers are? And then based on that, the type of work that the project is being proposed is going to influence how many points you get out of it. And again, I think one thing that's important is that in this section 1, out of the 6 different criteria, only 3 are being counted. So not everyone's going to have a project that's going to impact freight, or not everyone's going to have a project that, you know, reduces emissions in maybe a meaningful way. But then you still have, you know, 5 other categories to, you know, get points on.
And, you know, too, with the data that we have from the outputs of the freight study, we should be able to, I think, pretty easily summarize the miles of roadways in the region where we have, you know, truck ADTs for. So, you know, if we wanted to just say, let's just say hypothetically that we were going to have 5, you know, degrees of separation between the two, we could say, okay, that we could break it down into, you know, 20% of the total and say, okay, this is what the ADT looks like, you know, for the top 5th, and then the next 5th, and so on and so forth. So that's one option to do that, and then we could bring those numbers to you and see if that, you know, kind of jives with, you know, your viewing of things, just so that every, you know, it's kind of distributed. Because, you know, we also have to be careful with ADT, and we want to make sure that we're not overly skewing it. We're only, you know, certain roadway classifications are even going to qualify. So that's a potential.
Well, am I right in thinking though that as part of our submission of projects, we just about have to give you a truck ADT?
So we have all that now. So
Well, you have it
Well,
for
we
the
have-
National Highway System.
So
That's the
they,
only way to
yeah.
Yeah, we
place the
have it
truck
for what we
counts.
have it for, and then any roadways where we don't have it, you could, as a part of that back and forth process, if you
Because
didn't give us
the local
something to
roadways,
start,
you're not
right.
going to have it.
if we don't have it to start with, either one of two things. Either if you have something and you wanted to give it to us at the onset, that would be great. And if you didn't, that would be fine. What we would do is we would give you that sort of initial review, and we'd put in there 0 or whatever we'd put in there, and you'd say, okay, but actually, no, not 0, because we have this information, and then we'd say, okay, great, and then we change it.
Yeah.
So
Or we
that was basically the process we followed last time, was that we would say, okay, based on what we have and what, the information we have, this is what we think the score would be, and we hand it back, and then we got corrections, so.
And I think also part of the intent here is that, well, with the freight data, if we haven't already shared that link with everyone, we'll make sure that has been or will be shared. And so hopefully these things will help guide, like, well, what kind of project do I, if for freight, just for instance, if we share the freight data, you go, okay, take a look at the different things that were collected, you look at your roadway network, and you go, wow, like that I didn't really realize it was this, the height restriction was so low there, or that so many trucks were using the road, whatever it might be. Maybe that helps influence, well, what kind of project could we or should we be doing here? So it's not always just like, well, you're going to do this, we're going to look at the data and go, oh, well, it's not doing this. Like it should be informational both ways, I think. Same thing with safety, like the pre-evaluation process. Like that was sort of what happened in Atlantic City, right? We kind of take a high level look at some of the, substantial, issues with any particular project, safety in particular on this example, and we go, oh wow, you maybe didn't realize that this had all these, substantial issues with pedestrian or bicycle fatalities, and then maybe you kind of go back to the drawing board, go, wow, do we want to pursue a project here, and if we do, how can we make it better, or go, what, this is too much right now. We have something else that is maybe a secondary priority that we need to advance, and you advance that project. So I don't know. In my mind, when Katie and I were going through these and doing some of the scores, it was just, or in the back and forth with everyone in between the final score and we first asked for projects, was like, how give you the information you need to know to try to make something, to make it the best judgment call you can make for your particular roadway. So.
Another question on that, because of the lack of truck volume data on a lot of the local roads, in fact, most of them, if you're just looking at ADTs, like, is there an alternative, like, for example, in Vineland, if I show you Mill Road and I've got, hundreds of acres of industrial on a section of Mill Road, can that be like an alternative consideration to get points versus looking at ADT?
I think so.
Yeah, maybe it's about, like when we were first looking at this, we were thinking about, saying, oh, ADT 400 plus or whatever. But maybe we think about it more in terms of, high truck volume, medium truck volume, low truck volume. And, we put some of those numbers in as a guideline, but then, we can also base it, we put language in there, because what we don't want to do is put something really specific in there and then totally deviate from what we wrote down, because that's problematic. So, that's a good comment, because if we're thinking that, like, okay, for example, that there are roadways in Vineland that we don't have data for, but are really high for truck activity. So we want to make sure that we allow ourselves the room and the criteria so we can include that without just going off book, and sort of deviating from what we found. So
once the truck data becomes more available and we
Right.
flesh out what the truck volumes are, then you could always revise it at a later
Right.
date to more heavily rely on ADT. But
Yeah.
current situation,
Right.
not good.
Right. Well, and I almost jumped in earlier, and I suppose I should have, but so we actually are going to meet later this week to talk about the comment that you had given at the last TAC meeting and sort of looking at what the next steps maybe before the freight plan might be, and looking at some of the data that's out there that we couldn't incorporate because it hadn't come out yet. But I think that again goes to, for this iteration, we figure out what's the best way to categorize these projects for this scoring process, and then we know that we'll probably come back next time and change it once again, and I think that's totally fine.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely acceptable to have, if there's a missing data for a certain roadway segment or whatever, have the ability to allow for some sort of alternative analysis. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, I think, for that.
Yeah, just with the alternative analysis, I was been thinking, and we've discussed this a little bit internally. A tool that we have is our travel demand model, which we haven't really, mostly used for regional air quality purposes. But I think as an alternative, like tool or screening tool, we can look, like Mill Road. Now it doesn't. The model doesn't include a lot of the really local roads. It's like 600 and above generally. But we could look at some, trucks is a vehicle class that's included in the model. We could look at some, future projections, I think. I mean, all of these AADT, that's all like sort of existing. But, the model, really the main power, if you will, of the model is it's the forecasting attributes. So, I think it's a tool we could explore. We haven't used it specifically for this purpose yet, but again, I think as I've been saying internally, it's underutilized. I think has a lot more, features to it that we could utilize beyond the regional air quality analysis. So I think that's another idea to consider.
Thanks, Dave. All right, so just being mindful of time, it wasn't necessarily intending to spend as much time, but I just wanted to make note of two more things briefly. Tourism in section 2, which I just scrolled to. Again, in some ways similar to the congestion and on-road and freight, minus now that we have data for freight. So if people have or want to think about things that we could look at for tourism that aren't just like roads to the shore. Last time we looked at parks and open space, things like that. We're going to start to look at like cultural assets this round, but definitely if something comes to mind, email me, call, and let me know, and then we can kind of delve into that a little bit deeper to make sure we're capturing things that we could be or should be looking at for tourism.
And that's most important for the inland towns and communities, I would say, because it's obvious when you're at the shore.
Yeah.
It gets less obvious when you're inland, but at the same time, we felt when we scored it last time that there were definitely plenty of tourism points warranted in a lot of places throughout the region. So, we tried to capture that, but we were kind of, we allowed ourselves, the way it was written, we allowed ourselves the leeway to be able to do that because we included things like, trails and things like that in there. But, we were kind of scrambling a little bit to make sure that we were capturing that.
Yeah, there's definitely more we could be looking at, so just think about it. And the very last thing, and again, we can revisit this as we kind of go through the process, but under weighted length of project, which is section 3, kind of ties in with the cost benefit ratio in section 4. And essentially, I think what we've discussed is that if some of our projects that are submitted are asking just for federal funds, so let's say a $2 million project, they ask for $2 million. There's some sub-regional partners have a $2 million project, but they only ask for $1 million in federal funds, and then they're using local match of stuff, or not match, but they're contributing in somehow. So we wanted to make sure when we're looking at cost benefit ratio, we're just looking at federal funds for construction and construction engineering services. But then that kind of ties into the weighted length of the project. So if you got a $2 million project, you're doing 2 miles of roadway, but only 1 mile is being federally funded, in theory, it's half the cost, half the mileage. So we'd only count for 1 mile of the project. And then that way it'll hopefully the idea would be that, we're just sort of measuring the impacts of the federal funds equally, if that makes sense.
And what we were concerned about were the two things. One, some jurisdictions might be better equipped financially to take on paying for the rest of the project, and we were concerned about projects being biased towards the jurisdictions who could. And then the other piece of it was the alternative to this was basically going through and saying, okay, it's a $2 million project, we're giving you $1 million. So which of the individual features of the project that we're going to say were part of this? It's like, now let's just assume that we're doing half of the length of the project and call it a day. So it seemed like the more manageable way to look at it. So those were kind of the two pieces.
Again, and these didn't come up a lot in the last cycle, but there were definitely a few where like, how do we make sure we're accounting, for apples to apples? So if anyone comes up with something or has some insight, after today, this is an in flux sort of situation. So just definitely reach out to me either by, you can call me at the office or email me.